Are you staying up? You can stay if you want. I was very lucky this week, as I didn't have an introduction to my sermon. Becky Lazar sent me a whole series of one-liners. They were mistakes that actually appeared in synagogue bulletins. They were grammatical mistakes and they were spelling mistakes. So this is a much more of a visual joke. If you were reading it, then you'll be able to get, but I think you'll be able to get the flavor of it. So I want to thank Becky Lazar, for sending this to me. This is just one of them. It was actually found in a synagogue newsletter. It said, "Don't let worry kill you. Let your synagogue help." But it went on. "Join us for Oneg Shabbat after prayer and medication to follow." Thankfully, we have much better editors in our bulletin. Better medication. So the American Psychological Association reported ahead of this past election that more than 2/3 of U.S. adults, 68%, say that the presidential election was a source of significant stress in their life. Strange as it may seem, a few weeks later, I'm not feeling much more relaxed. But it probably has more to do with COVID than it has to do with the presidential election. And I wish, however, there was a switch that I could turn off and on. I could become more worried as I went outside, but then when I got home, I could just flip the switch off and I would feel much better. I'm sure you'd all agree, wouldn't it be great if that's the way human beings were wired? With a switch for on and off for all of our emotions, so that we could deal more courageously with what's going on in our worlds, but there aren't switches for our emotions. There was a wonderful movie that came out a long time ago called Moonstruck. There's a scene in the movie where Nicolas Cage has fallen for Cher. And Cher believes it's a relationship that cannot be. And he persists. And she finally slaps him across the face and says, "Snap out of it." Wouldn't it be great if that's the way our emotions work, that we could just snap out of it rather than continue to feel those emotions that weigh us down? Judaism has long given us stages for how we live in our lives. But that doesn't mean we reach each milestone at the same pace. Just because Shiva is over doesn't mean we're ready to emerge into the world. Just because we reach the age of bar or bat mitzvah doesn't mean we're any more capable of being an adult. Just because we've arrived at the chuppah doesn't mean we're any more equipped to enter the adult relationship of marriage. And just as I have preached so many times over the course of this pandemic, not everyone is finding their way as easily as others. The announcement of a potential vaccine this week from Pfizer doesn't mean everyone will be willing tomorrow to accept the approval of the FDA, even if it came so quickly. Some will take a little more time to decide on their level of confidence in that vaccine. People just move at different paces. The analogy I have often used in our congregation time and time again here in my sermons and at board meetings and congregational meetings about our community is we are all on one side of the river. And we all have to get to the other side of the river. Some will run across the bridge. Some will walk across the bridge. Some might even drive across the bridge. Some will swim in the water. Some will take a boat. There are so many different ways to get across. Some of those routes will be faster and some will be slower, but that's not what's important. What's important is that we get everybody from one side to the other. So today I announce to you it's time to heal, and you should take the time you need to heal. We could not have a better example than we have in this morning's Torah reading. V'tamat Sarah b'Kiryat Arba hi Chevron be'eretz Canaan, v'yavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkota. Sarah dies in Kiryat Arba, now known today as Chevron, in the land of Israel. Abraham proceeded to mourn and to eulogize her, to cry and to offer a word of farewell. Abraham immediately sets out to do what he needs to do. He goes through the process of grieving, of coming to grips with the mistakes he made as a husband. He tries to give Sarah the burial that is due her proper. Even if he wasn't a great husband in life, maybe in this moment he could. And then he buries her. V'achrechein kavar Avraham et Sarai ishto el me'arat sidei ha'machpelah al pnei mamrei hi Chevron be'eretz Canaan. And he purchases a piece of land, Ma'arat ha'machpelah, and he buries her there. And then Abraham moves on. Almost an entire chapter devoted to his burial, his grieving, his mourning, and then he moves on. For Abraham, life moves on, and he sets out on his next task, and that is marrying off his son Isaac, as if Isaac needs the help. Remember, Isaac is a grown adult, more than capable of finding his own spouse, more than capable of being one who knows what he likes and what he doesn't. Maybe I'm just being cynical, but we don't have a single word from Isaac on this subject. When Abraham says to his servant Eliezer, please go find for him a wife. But Abraham pushes forward without regard for what's going on around him. His singular focus might be what assisted him in amassing extraordinary wealth, achieving material success, but he seems to be oblivious to the people around him as he plows ahead. God says, I'll make you a great nation, and you will not take for me a wife for my servant, from my servant for my son Isaac from the Canaanites. It's where he was from. And we wonder in this conversation between Abraham and Eliezer, where is Isaac? Why isn't he weighing in on the characteristic traits of a person he might fall in love with? We haven't heard neither hide nor hair from Isaac since the story of his binding on the altar. Seemingly, he is well beyond repair. After that story, we might have thought we would have heard from him. I'm pretty sure that's what Abraham thinks. Without regard, without a single conversation, Abraham goes off to find a wife for Isaac, a spouse for his son, a dad who's thinking maybe he is living too much a life confined to himself, life of a hermit. He must say to himself, is unhealthy for my son. Maybe he's just looking out for his little boy. Maybe Abraham sees the loneliness that Isaac feels in his life. So enough conjecture for the time being. Let's just skip ahead. We know Eliezer, Abraham's servant, is successful in bringing back Rebekah. And here is the moment when Isaac and Rebekah's eyes meet for the first time. Vatisa Rivka et eineha v'tere et Yitzchak v'tipol min hagamal. Rebekah looks up and she sees Isaac and she basically falls off her camel. V'tipol me'al hagamal. She falls off her camel. She can't believe it. He is gorgeous. What a hunk. Raising her eyes, Rebekah saw Isaac, and her heart alighted. She turns to Eliezer, she says, who is that guy? Maybe I can get him to buy me a drink. Vayomer ha'eved hu Adoni. And the servant said, that's the guy I've been talking about. That's Isaac, my master. Vayisaper ha'eved liYitzchak et kol hadvarim asher asa. And then he runs off to Isaac to say, you wouldn't believe what I found. You wouldn't believe who I found. Oh, and his eyes looked over to her. Vayahaveha Yitzchak. And he immediately fell in love. I love a story like this. It's a story of love at first sight, quite literally. And it goes on, Vayavel Yitzchak Ohela Sarah Imo. And he took Rebekah into his mother's tent. Vayikach et Rivka vatihi lo la'isha. And he took her to be his wife, Vayaveha. And he loved her. Twice in the same sentence, he says he loved her. But then it's the clincher of the sentence, it's the climax of that moment that gets me deep in my heart. It says, Vayinachem Yitzchak acharei imo. And Isaac found comfort after his mother's death. Isaac was suffering terribly until he met Rebekah. I imagine the conversations that Isaac and his mother Sarah had all through his growing up. Abraham was probably a difficult father, probably challenged Isaac to be someone who maybe he wasn't. And he would go back to his mother, I imagine, and say, Ma, Dad is being so hard on me. He wants me to be something that I'm not. And you can imagine Sarah stroking his hair and saying, it'll be all right. You be you. And you can always find comfort in coming to talk to me. I also know what it feels like to be a bit discarded by Abraham. I think the conversations about what life must have been like as soon as he came back home after the binding of Isaac's story, in which Isaac turns to his mother Sarah and says, you wouldn't believe what he tried to do today. And how Isaac must have broken down crying, and the way Sarah must have held him as he wept into her shoulder, trying to utter the words, Dad tried to kill me today. And you can imagine the consolation that she brought to him. Maybe Isaac was a mama's boy. Clearly not the brawny type like his half-brother Ishmael. But so what? The connection between Isaac and his mother must have been very deep. The pain of his life could only be mitigated by his mother, and so I can only imagine what he must have felt like when she died. Then Rebekah comes onto the scene, and he realizes there still is kindness in the world. There is hope for a better future than his scarred and wounded past. It's an amazing comment that Rashi makes, quoting Midrash Breshit Rabbah, Shekol zman shesara kayemet haya ner daluk me'erev Shabbat le'erev Shabbat. The entire time that Sarah was alive, says the Midrash, there was a lit candle in the house. It went from Erev Shabbos to Erev Shabbos. All week long, there was always a light burning in the house. Ubracha mitzuya be'isa. And there was true blessing in the bread that she made. V'anan kashur ala ohel. And there was a protective cloud over their tent. Umishamet pasku. And when she died, all of that stopped. The light went out. The protection disappeared. The blessings dissipated. Ukshebata Rivka. But when Rivka came, chazru. All of that came back. For while Sarah was living, she provided so much to the household of Abraham and Sarah that was missing as soon as she died, seemingly never to return. But says the Midrash, Rebekah brought it all back. It's not just time to hit the reset. We need time to hit the reset. Carl Sagan once said, "For small creatures such as we, the vastness is unbearable. Only through love can we make it." Allison Chu, in an incredible article that appeared this week in the Washington Post, said the antidote to the chaos we feel, to the pain we feel, to the suffering in the world, to the anxiety of COVID, is to find personal relationships. As if she was commenting on this morning's Parsha. Referring to Stephen Stosny, a relationship expert from Maryland, who coined the phrase election stress disorder back in 2016, Stosny went on to remark, "I'm not saying ignore politics, just put it in perspective. On your deathbed, you're not going to regret who wins an election or who loses. What you will regret is not being kind and compassionate enough to the people you love." And we're not being kind and compassionate to the people we love. When we begin a funeral, just before the liturgy begins, we do a ritual called Kriya, where we tear either a garment or a ribbon. It doesn't matter, the symbolism is powerful. Loss tears us apart. Our heart is torn like the fabric. It's an outward symbol of inward damage. It tells people on the outside, be gentle with us. And no matter how hard we might work to sew that garment, that ribbon back together, it is beyond repair. It will always be there. You'll be able to see the scar. We can and we do move on. But it is there, always, still taking up a place in our most sacred and holy organ, our heart. The tear is there. The ribbon reminds us, be gentle with each other. This week's Parsha says we move at our own pace. Please, God, give each other, give all of us the opportunity to arrive at some healing in our own time. Shabbat Shalom. We continue with Musaf, page 184, Chatzi Kaddish. Please rise.